Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. So, believe it or not, it has been just 2 weeks and change since Donald Trump took office. The news is coming thick and fast. The United States issued tariffs on China yesterday. China has already retaliated in kind. The same thing nearly happened with Mexico and Canada until those two countries reached last-minute quote unquote deals with the Trump administration, although it is unclear how significant the new proposals might be to actually tackle fentanyl flows, for example. Foreign aid has been frozen. Mass deportations have begun. Elon Musk and others are waging a war against the federal bureaucracy. And all of that is just in the last few days. I haven't even mentioned the threats against Greenland and Panama. If this is your first time on FP Live, welcome. These are long-form conversations with policymakers and experts. I often take subscriber questions. If you want to join in the fun, hit the subscribe button, use the code FP Live for a discount. We are also a podcast, which I urge you to follow. Now, we know that part of the Trump team's strategy is to flood the zone with news and initiatives. So how do we find the signal in the noise? And since we're FP, how do we do that in a truly global sense? Well, today I have three really smart guests on three different continents. Kishore Mahbubani is a top former Singaporean diplomat. He is now a distinguished fellow at the National University of Singapore's Asia Research Institute. Natalie Tocci is the director of the Italian think tank Istituto Affari Internazionali. She's formerly served as a special advisor to EU High Representatives Federica Mogherini and Josep Borrell. And Ed Luce is the Financial Times' US national editor and a columnist there. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for making time. Ed, I'm going to start with you. You're in the thick of it in Washington, D.C., so let's try and find that signal in the noise. If you had to have a broad takeaway from Trump's first 2 weeks in office, what would it be?
It would be Elon Musk's role. It would be the takeover of the federal bureaucracy, his, I guess, in a sense, sort of hostile takeover of the Office of Personnel Management, of the federal payment system at Treasury, of the GSA, which runs federal real estate, and of course his shuttering or near shuttering of USAID. This is an extraordinary sort of challenge, unprecedented challenge to US regular order, to the rule of law, because he has no official position to do this and is, of course, unconfirmed by the US Senate. And a sort of galactic scale conflict of interest looming there, given Musk's multi-billion existing contracts with his companies and the federal government, and indeed his own sort of multifarious business interests, and where the federal government and regulators that he's planning to shut down or at least denude, where they clash with or potentially assist his bottom line, his business bottom line. And of course, that does impinge from the global perspective that you quite rightly mentioned on US-China relations. A third of Tesla's sales take place in China. And his sort of great regulatory hopes for autonomous cars actually lie with Chinese regulators. So that, to me, in a really sort of tight, hot competition of extraordinary number of things that are happening, that to me is the most important. Keep your eye on the money and the money man.
Very interesting. Natalie, you're in Rome. How are his early moves being seen in Europe? It is striking to me that some of Trump's biggest attempted moves so far have been not on adversaries, but on allies. So you have the threat of tariffs, demands for high defense spending among NATO members, questioning Greenland's sovereignty. How worried is Europe?
I mean, it's very worried. And I think there are sort of four main points, some of which were predictable, some of which less so, and all of which being very, very concerning. So in a sense, we knew that Trump would come with a protectionist agenda. We knew that there would be talk about tariffs. Now, the move has not been made yet on Europe, but everyone anticipates that this indeed is going to be the case. And the big concern is whether Europe is actually going to stick together. Now, in principle, it should. In principle, it must, given that this is actually a competence at supranational level. But it's fairly clear that Trump is going to try divide and rule. And in particular, possibly offering sweet deals to his friends, Viktor Orban, Giorgia Meloni. And the question is whether these leaders are actually going to say, well, thanks, but no thanks, you've got to speak to Brussels, or whether they're actually going to fold, right? Given that they are Eurosceptic deep down, which kind of brings me to the second point, which is, in a sense, the sort of all-out assault on democracy. I mean, Ed was talking about some of the more domestic implications. There is obviously that international implication. This, I guess, is more on the Musk than on the Trump side. But in that duo, it's fairly clear that now, whereas domestically there's a MAGA agenda, at European level there is a mega agenda. And where, in particular, Musk has been very explicitly supporting the various AFDs and Fratelli d'Italias and reform parties and so on in Europe. And of course, the aim is that of, which relates to the first point, dividing Europe, because it's much easier, obviously, to deal with partners that are no longer partners, but they're rather some sort of mix of an adversary, as you were implying, and simply a vassal state, right? If those vassal states are divided amongst them. Which kind of brings me to the third point, which is Trump 2, in a sense, as opposed to Trump 1, having a far more explicitly imperial nature to it. And this is where the threats on Greenland come in. As we have seen, it is more than, whereas I would say in the first few days, there was a sense of, Trump should be taken seriously, but not literally. As time has gone by, there is this kind of, growing fear and feeling that perhaps actually he should be taken literally as well. And so this really speaks of a sort of Trump 2, sorry, maybe there will be Trump 3 at some point, administration, which is not only nationalist protectionist and, sort of authoritarian, but possibly imperial as well.
Wow. Kishore, you are in Singapore. I know you were also in India earlier today. How are you seeing the early days of the Trump administration?
Well, I can tell you that most Asians are shocked by the complete chaos in Washington, D.C. And I guess, to Ed's point about trying to dismantle the government, Asians find that very strange because Asians like order and predictability and good governance. And here is Trump tearing it apart, echoing the warning of Tom Friedman once made that if you want a country with the least amount of governance, go to Somalia. So we will sort of wonder whether Trump is creating a Somalia in the United States. But at the same time, I also warn my Asian friends that whatever you do, don't underestimate the United States, because the United States is a very unusual society. In most societies, chaos sort of brings it down. In the case of the United States, for whatever reasons, for complex historical reasons, political chaos actually strengthens the social and political fabric of the United States and makes it in some ways, over the long run, a strong society. But nonetheless, I can tell you that in Asia, as you know, the most important player is clearly China. And China is watching Trump more closely than any other country is. And so far, I must say, Trump is delivering at least two goodies to China. Number one, he's clearly playing a short-term game, not a long-term game. And in the case of China, China understands better than most countries in the world that a new world is emerging. And I describe the new world as a 3M world: multi-civilizational, multipolar, multilateral, to deal with global challenges. The Chinese are preparing for a world of 2050 rather than the world of 2025. they're in a sense running a marathon, not a sprint. Trump is running the sprint. They're running a marathon. They say the sprinter will go by me. In the long run, the marathoner will win. So in that sense, if he carries on at this rate, then the Chinese will say, okay, time will be on our side. And at the same time, of course, he's alienating so many countries, especially friends, so quickly. Frankly, the Chinese may say, why don't we have 8 years of Trump? Because after 8 years of Trump, you wonder what the world will look like in terms of its approaches towards the United States. But the final thought I'll mention is, of course, the Chinese are also prepared for a big blow from Trump. At some point, they know it's going to come. They got to be ready for it. They're holding their firepower. It's going to come, and then they'll retaliate.
Wow. Ed, one of the themes we've often returned to with Trump is this idea that he is transactional. And part of the thinking around that is that when you are openly transactional and countries know it, do those other countries then start playing you at your own game? And just in the last day or so, we've been wondering if that might have happened with Mexico and Canada, where Trump threatened tariffs on Mexico. They agreed to put 10,000 troops on the border, but they already had some plans to do so. Same thing with Canada and border security. There was a pre-existing ambitious plan. So it strikes me that a lot of what we're seeing is theater. And the underlying deals, whether actually flows of fentanyl, the needle gets moved on that, is something that is almost lost.
Yes, although of course in Canada's case, Trudeau came up with a fentanyl czar. The fentanyl that comes into the US from Canada, I think they seized 40 pounds last year, as several thousand pounds from Mexico. It's not even a drop in the bucket. It's pure kabuki. What's going on here, at least between Canada and the US. Ordinarily, when you have a trade dispute in the post-WTO world, where nobody's paying attention to the dispute resolution mechanisms, ordinarily you would negotiate, and if those negotiations broke down, you would then impose punitive measures. You'd raise tariffs, etc. Trump started the other way around. He announced punitive measures. Some confusion as to what it was that Canada or Mexico needed to do to avoid those punitive measures. And now, at least for 30 days, we found out. It's a bit of theater. It's presenting him with what he can declare to the low information voter as a win, but which is actually a win, at least for 30 days, for Canada and Mexico. Now, I'm not at all confident that 30 days from now, we won't resume with those levels of tariffs, depending on which side of the bed Trump got out of that day. We did see a mini sort of dress rehearsal for this with Colombia a few days ago, when the Colombians refused to accept deportees, illegal immigrants from America shackled on a US military plane. Trump then accepted when the Colombian president sent his own presidential plane to pick them up from a third country, and crisis over. But he threatened massive tariffs, a visa ban, all kinds of things. And I think that it was no coincidence that day the Chinese ambassador to Colombia said US-China-Colombia relations have never been stronger. The transactionalism that Trump is exhibiting, it is not the kind of transaction you or I understand by the meaning of that word, which is we make a deal, we have a contract, that contract is sacred, it's enforceable in the courts. Trump's transactionalism is dispensable. So your confidence when you make a deal with Trump that Trump will stick to that deal is low already, given Trump's modus operandi, and I suspect it's getting lower all the time. This is, as Kishore mentioned, a great opportunity for China to say, look, we uphold the rules of the system, we uphold multilateralism, we uphold a trade regime with, with clear and transparent regulations. Trump, I think, threatens basically to self-cannibalize if he goes on like this, and that will do great harm to America's ability to strike deals, the art of the deal, around the world.
Can I add to that? Oh.
Please do. And Kishore,
Yeah.
add to it, it strikes me that one of the things Ed said about the rules, a rules-based order, Chinese leaders are repeatedly saying that that is what they're in favor of, most recently at Davos. And it strikes me that Trump is playing into their hands in that sense.
Well, I mean, there's a solid historical reason why the Chinese like the international rules-based order. Firstly, the past 40 years of human and social development in China have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. Never before in Chinese history has such a large section of the Chinese population been educated, given healthcare, access to good jobs, ability to travel, and so on and so forth. But equally importantly, and this is the fundamental point, the Chinese have asked themselves fundamental questions about why they suffered a century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. And among the key answers they came up with was that China suffered a century of humiliation because China built walls around itself and closed itself up from the rest of the world. So the answer to ensure that there's no century of humiliation is to demolish the wall and integrate with the rest of the world. And the only reason why China has been able to integrate with the rest of the world is because of the Western gift of the post-1945 rules-based order. And certainly China could not have emerged the world's largest trading power without having the World Trade Organization, for example. So there are fundamental reasons why China appreciates this rules-based order. It has worked for China. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize an equally important streak in China is their streak of pragmatism. As you know, Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black, cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat. So pragmatism is very much ingrained in the Chinese character too. So in that sense, Trump's deal making also provides an opportunity for China, because I can well imagine a situation whereby for the Chinese, getting American acceptance of the One China policy, locked in solid One China commitment, it would be an incredible gift to China. And if Trump asks a high price for it, whether it's in trade or economics or whatever it is, the Chinese say, okay, I'll pay the high price, but I get something that is absolutely critical to me, because at the end of the day, Taiwan represents the last living symbol of the century of humiliation. If they can wipe it out, I mean, that doesn't mean they take over Taiwan. Doesn't mean they take over Taiwan. But it does mean that there's a commitment to One China, and that's what they want. And they're prepared to work out a good deal with Trump for that. So that creates an opportunity for a good transaction.
Fascinating. Natalie, build on that from a European perspective. This idea that on the one hand, Trump is transactional, but deals are not sacred. And yet, unlikely deals could be struck in this environment. If you were still advising Brussels, how would you tell European leaders to approach this new administration?
Well, let me answer that also by making reference to this China angle and how this triangulates with Europe. So probably if we'd had this conversation even only a month ago, I would have probably said, well, Europeans are going to try bending over backwards to please Trump, particularly because they're concerned that he's going to disengage from Ukraine and European security. And part of the give may actually end up being more assertive towards China. And actually, I'm not sure this is how it's going to play out. I'm not even sure this is how it should play out. Now, I think what's interesting here is that whereas, in the first Trump, again, if we take by point of comparison the first Trump administration, China actually played that moment, I think, rather skillfully, right? So China kind of presented itself as the defender of the multilateral system while the US temporarily checked out of that system. And actually, there was quite a bit of kind of entente, right, between Europe and China. Now, I think, truth be said, over the last 4 years, that relationship has obviously become far more complicated. It's become more complicated because of the Russia-China angle, particularly as far as Ukraine is concerned, because Europeans have more of a sense of what their economic security should be all about. So in a sense, we don't have as much sort of rose-tinted lenses as we used to have vis-a-vis China. However, much of the reason why Europe has become, in a sense, harsher towards China has to do with its partnership with the United States. And now that that is, up in the air, there is sort of kind of growing sense of, well, firstly, we can't really afford to have a two-front trade war, both with China and with the United States, right? And given, of course, we don't want to have a trade war with the United States, but if we don't have a choice, then maybe this is the time for a bit of a timeout with China. If you add onto it the fact that, again, if China this time around too plays its cards relatively skillfully, perhaps showing a more cooperative face on questions related to European security, Russia, Ukraine, etc., it may well be that actually what I thought would have happened only a month ago will turn out not to be correct, and that Europe will really feel, well, this is the time in which we have to look for, I wouldn't say necessarily partnerships with others, but at the very least, not to complicate even further relations with others because we have more than a mouthful with Trump himself.
Ed, as we continue to try and find sort of a signal in the noise, this administration has come in at a moment where there are many conflicts raging around the world. And one of sort of the earlier animating principles in Trump world was that the United States needs to pull back from all of these global conflicts, doesn't need to be a global policeman. And I was struck recently, an interview that Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave to Megyn Kelly, in which he said that the unipolar moment might be over. And this hasn't gotten much coverage, but I think the point he was trying to make is that there have been multilateral, multipolar moments in the past, and the United States really is just going to look after its own interests, really not care that much about what's going on elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think Marco Rubio is right. I mean, I think he would have been right if he'd said that 15 years ago, though. I think the unipolar moment's been over for a while. I mean, from the world's point of view, I think a lot of my American and European friends are surprised by how unfazed a lot of the world is, particularly the global South, by the return of Trump. And that is because I think the proclamations and insistence by Biden, by Obama, by others on the liberal international order has been for a long time seen as hollow and hypocritical by much of the world, and understandably so, not just since October the 7th, but those double standards have been very starkly on display since then, but through a sort of number of wars and events where America, seems to want the law for its enemies, but special dispensation for its friends, and that means the law isn't the law, because the law is supposed to be blind. So we're losing what I think of as the preachy American and replacing the preachy American with the ugly American. And for those who always thought America, had an uglier underside, this is actually not such a shock after all. Now, I happen to believe in values and rules and the international order, and to think that the hypocrisy is the compliment that vice pays to virtue, that the hypocrisies are better than not having values and rules at all, and that system was set up by the United States and can only really be sustained by a United States that believes in it. And the United States clearly no longer believes in it. That is an absolutely unequivocal message from Trump. I think Marco Rubio used to believe in it, but he serves Trump. He's a loyalist to Trump, and you don't serve Trump unless you pledge personal loyalty, not just to Trump, but to that philosophy. And so I would sort of conclude this slightly rambling answer to your very good question by saying, don't pay too much attention to what anybody who works for Trump used to think. It really doesn't matter what Marco Rubio used to say about Ukraine, what he used to say about the liberal international order, what he used to say about China. All that matters is what Trump thinks now, and he will parrot that. That is the condition for his job, and the same applies to Mike Waltz as the national security advisor. The same applies to John Ratcliffe at the CIA. This is an administration of loyalists, and Trump's instincts are what will govern it.
Kishore, on that topic of hypocrisy, professed values, rules, I think well before any of us, you have been pointing these trends out about the United States. And I'm curious where you sit now that if you go with Ed's point that the hypocrisy was better than an absence of rules, how does the rest of the world deal with that new reality?
Well, you're right, Ravi. I've been writing about this for some time now. But, I want to cite a very important statistic here. 12% of the world's population lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. And there's no question that in the past 200 years, world history has been dominated by the West, by the 12% of the world's population. One of the structural changes that I referred to in my earlier remarks about this being a multi-civilizational, multipolar, multilateral world is that other civilizations, other societies are coming back with great force. And therefore, one of the natural consequences of that is that the natural deference to the West is disappearing in the world. And that's a major structural change, In my memoirs, by the way, Living the Asian Century, I describe how as a child, I'm saying this quite honestly, as a child, I believe that I, as an Asian, was mentally and culturally inferior to the white man. That's what I genuinely believe as a child in a British colony of Singapore. I mean, that was the world in the 1950s when I grew up. Today, that's all gone and is replaced by an explosion of cultural confidence in the rest of the world. And I want to mention here two words that haven't been mentioned specifically yet, which I think have had a major impact on the 88%. One is, of course, the Ukraine. And let me emphasize that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was illegal under international law. It should be condemned and Russia should withdraw from Ukraine. That international law is very clear on that. But at the same time, when the West imposed sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, 85% of the world's population did not impose sanctions on Russia. 85%. And that was a very powerful signal from the rest of the world saying, hey, please understand that we have our own interests. And for example, you keep saying the war is unprovoked. We don't believe you. The president of Brazil has said this. The president of South Africa has said this. So the view of the South and Ukraine is very different. But the second word, which has had an even greater impact in the last, I would say, year and a half, has been, as you know, a four-letter word called Gaza. And I think when future historians write about our time, they will describe the enormous impact that Gaza has had. I mean, Ed is absolutely right. Hypocrisy is the complement that vice pays to virtue. But there comes a point in time when you say that you stand for a certain virtue, you cannot remain completely silent and do nothing when something like that is happening. And Gaza, I can tell you, because it's, Gaza, the reason why Gaza is so powerful is because of social media. And social media brings Gaza into billions of homes every day. And the impact it has had on the standing of the West, on the rest of the world, has been phenomenal. So actually what we are seeing beneath all the noise are structural changes in the world order. And this is my biggest fear, is that many in the West don't understand that the West now has to make intelligent adaptations and adjustments to a world that treats the West very differently. And the world wants to work with the West. The world doesn't want to destroy the West. The world doesn't want to demolish the West. But the world wants to deal with a more realistic and frankly, a more humble West. And that's what the world hopes that all these recent developments will lead to.
Natalie, let's build on that. And I'm going to offer 2 words of my own for you to kickstart this part of it. And those 2 words are soft power. It's fair to say that the last couple of weeks have seen the reemergence of hard power at some significant cost to American soft power. And I'm curious, from your vantage point in Europe, how European leaders might be looking at those developments, because Europe's response could also mean a similar thinking about a trade-off of how they want to use or deploy hard power and how they think about the cost of soft power. You were talking about China earlier, but in this new world that we seem to be entering, what does that trade-off look like for Europeans?
So a couple of remarks, one more related to the soft and the other to the hard. And I think actually this relates to, in a sense, very different geographies in many respects. So starting with the soft end of this, so I think Ed was rightly saying, well, and this relates also to the points that Kishore was making, the rest of the world is largely unfazed by this, is this, and there are 2 possible explanations, one explanation is that actually that 85% quite likes the transactionalism, is not that fussed about the rules and the norms and the principles. I personally don't buy that explanation. I think it's rather the result of a different explanation, which is the fact that that 85% views someone like Trump, aggressive as he is, as symptomatic of a multipolar world, a world in which indeed the United States does not have the ambition to set those global rules and norms. Now, I think this leaves basically, and let me make sort of, the Ukraine, related to the points that Kishore was making, the Ukraine-Gaza sort of distinction here. I think, to be honest, Ukraine, for reasons that Kishore was pointing out, did leave that 85% with at least a dilemma that so far they have not, I think, faced, which is, well, if you say that you are for international law and you recognize that there's been a violation, but you're essentially not willing to pay a price, right? For example, through sanctions to ensure that those laws are respected, where do you actually stand on those laws? So I think there's a sort of contradiction there for that 85%, which remains sort of unresolved. But then, of course, on the other side of the equation, and here comes the total erosion of that soft power, which largely relies on sort of reputation and credibility and legitimacy, which has to do more with the Gaza end of the story as far as the 15% is concerned, yeah? And here I'm thinking mainly, obviously, about what Europeans have been doing, which has been, frankly speaking, just as bad as what the United States has been doing. And here goes the hypocrisy and the double standards and all the rest of it. And so, to be honest, I think that if we're serious about that soft power vis-a-vis the 85%, until and unless we tackle that problem, we're really nowhere. Moving on to the hard power end of the story, to be honest, I largely see this as far as the European is concerned, as a story which relates to Europe itself, and obviously in the relationship with Russia and the transatlantic relationship. So again, if we look at Trump as essentially simply being the symptom of a structural trend of US disengagement from European security, well, I mean, and given that you're faced with a war, which, frankly speaking, in some shape or form is going to carry on for the foreseeable future, well, either you get your act together on that hard, or again, you're in very deep trouble. So I would really kind of make a geographic distinction, as far as Europe is concerned, between that soft and that hard, where the soft really relates to the 85%, the hard very much relates to the European continent itself. Again, in a context in which there is this structural sort of disalignment between US and European interests.
Ed, I like how you kickstarted this conversation by looking at Musk and his influence so far on sort of dismantling what he likes to call the deep state. Were you to project forward a little bit from here, what are the sort of trend lines and storylines we should all be keeping an eye out?
So I'm interested. I mean, Musk is a good a way to begin answering that question. It's been assumed, by the way, that Musk and this town's too small for the two of them, for Trump and Musk. But actually, the more laws that Musk allegedly breaks, the more constitutional norms he trashes, the more he is absolutely beholden to Trump as his pardoner. The idea that oligarchs own politicians is the wrong way round. I refer you to Russia. It's the leader, it's the strong man who owns the oligarchs, and it's very clear that Musk is now beholden to Trump. But that trend line, the interaction between oligarchy and politics in the United States and around the world, is a hugely important feature of our world today, of democracies and non-democracies alike. And the fact that you were talking about soft power, the fact that the United States as a model has, at least by many parts of the world, I'd argue sort of at times majorities of the world, been seen as an attractive model. I don't think it's going to be seen as quite so attractive anymore. The idea in terms of what to watch, that China could actually be the big bet in terms of climate change because of its transformation in terms of electronic vehicles and clean tech, and its extraordinary competitiveness in green energy, and the cheapness, allegedly heavily subsidized, of Chinese exports of clean tech, that would make China the real game changer here, because China doesn't repudiate the idea of man-made global warming. China hasn't, as Trump has just done, walked away from the Paris climate treaty, and China is in a position. Natalie was sort of putting very, very felicitously the European reappraisal of this triangular relationship, now that Trump is really threatening a very aggressive sort of economic warfare on Europe. Europe isn't the next shoe to drop. That a European-China sort of concord or understanding, whereby timeout is called on their trade disputes, where Europe is more receptive to Chinese investment and job creation in clean tech, is a trend, I think, that could have possibilities way beyond the sort of climate change implications of that, that could have geopolitical realignment implications. So that's another one to watch. And finally, I'll just mention the desire for liberal democracy to fail by the Trump administration, by Musk as well, in particular. Musk's war on America's allies, I've written about this a few weeks ago. His attempt to stoke racial conflict in Britain, his addressing of the AfD, a neo-Nazi party, a couple of weeks ago in Germany, in which he urged Germans not to feel guilt for their history. This is a pretty extraordinary thing that's happening with no precedent, which the largest sort of ally, the United States, is attempting to undermine and destroy liberal democracies in smaller allies. And so far, the liberal democracies are behaving according to type. They're frightened of their own shadow. They're feckless. They're exactly what the sort of fascist mindset says liberal democracies would do, which is weak, frightened of their own shadow. That is a very ominous trend line that I suspect is going to deepen and go on.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about one other trend line, the role of so-called swing states in geopolitics. You were just in India this morning. If you are a country like India or an Indonesia or a Nigeria or a Saudi Arabia, are you looking at this emerging next 3-4 years as a period where you can just be nimble, strike deals, and advance your interests?
Yeah, just very quickly before I answer your question, I want to reinforce what Ed just said. I think one thing that actually might bring European Union and the Global South together is that Ed pointed out that this blatant interference in the internal political affairs of a state. One of the things actually is quite sacred to most states of the Global South is that let there be no foreign interference in my internal affairs. Now, that's a principle that actually paradoxically the West has been eroding. The West said human rights is more important rather than internal interference in states. Now, I think Europe will realize that actually keeping Musk money away from the AFD, because it's technically illegal. I mean, the US cried, hell and blood and said, oh, the Russians elected Hillary, Russian money was terrible. Now, what's the difference between Russian money electing Hillary and Musk money electing AFD? Come on, it's the same principle. There should be no interference in the internal affairs. That's one thing that's actually something that the Global South would strongly support if the Europeans stood hard on that. But on the role of the swing states, Ravi, there's no question that a lot of swing states around the world are beginning to be aware that all the mental maps they had over the last 40, 50 years with a very clearly, a whole international system that rested in one way or another on some kind of benign American interpretation of international law, in America that supported the WTO, in America that supported the WHO. It's all gone, right? So now what do you do? And so clearly, there are lots of independent deals that are going on around the world. I mean, Natalie mentioned that there's been that a new thinking will emerge in Europe towards China. I was shocked to learn when I was in Mumbai having tea with a very well-informed Indian that Indian-Chinese relations have improved significantly in the last few weeks. I didn't know this, by the way. And I learned that when the Indian Foreign Secretary, you know how senior Indian Foreign Secretary is, Ravi, was in Beijing recently, and after that, the resumption of direct flights, giving visas to Chinese businessmen to come to India. And frankly, I think the Modi government has come to realize that if you want to build India as a manufacturing power, and I think India has got tremendous potential as a manufacturing power, you got to work with China. Because, as Tom Friedman pointed out, China's share of global manufacturing in the year 2000 was 5%. By 2030, it'll be 45%. 45% of global manufacturing is coming from China. So you cannot possibly build manufacturing industry anywhere in the world, including the United States, unless you collaborate in one form or another with China. So therefore, the gravitational pull by China, especially for the swing states, and even if a country like India, which, as you know, Ravi has been deeply suspicious of China, starts to realize that, hey, we got to work with China, then clearly more and more states around the world are going to feel that way. And in that sense, frankly, if the Chinese play carefully and low-key, Trump could be a big gift to China.
Natalie, let me give you the last word. A lot of our subscribers have been messaging us and asking us to talk a little bit about foreign aid. And that is one of the clear casualties in the last couple of weeks that has immense ripple effects with USAID not being able to disperse the money it has been dispersing in Ukraine and so many conflicts around the world. What is your sense of what that means longer term?
Yeah, perhaps a couple of remarks. One actually related to what was being said, and then another on this question of aid. And I may be putting this a little bit too bluntly, but it may well be that if Trump overdoes the transactionalism, it may paradoxically, rather than breed transactionalism, breed partnerships, right? Others partnership, sort of bandwagoning effect against the United States or in protection of the United States. And I think this kind of European-China story or this India-China story may be part of this, right? Because indeed, as we were talking about climate. Now, it may well be that, sort of right-wing governments in Europe don't really care about climate and climate action, but they do care about energy prices. And to the extent that Europe does not have hydrocarbon resources, as a trade war is being waged against it by the United States, it may actually need cooperation with China, particularly on green technologies, right? So you can see the way in which this could play out, actually reinforcing others' partnerships, right? Precisely as a consequence of that transactionalism. I think as far as the US aid question is concerned, I think there are really kind of two sides to the story. I mean, the first is the immediate effect that has to do with, a great deal of humanitarian and development assistance coming offline and what are the implications for all sorts of third countries. But then again, how is it that other countries may step in or not, right? I mean, this goes back to the conversation we were having about soft power. As US soft power erodes, right? If other countries are capable of doing so, actually their own soft power may increase if they manage to step into that void. But then I think there's a sort of final dimension which brings us back to this conversation about rules and a rules-based system, right? Because if, you can basically say, well, a contract is null and void, right? These are agreements that are signed. And at the end of the day, you could just say, well, the law, so what, right? I mean, this is as true domestically, but domestically there are more avenues in a sense to sort of seek justice. But internationally, we're basically left with the law of the jungle. And so I wonder what will be ultimately not so much the short term, but the sort of medium and long term reactions to that, because it's fairly clear that we all stand to lose, right? From the jungle, whether we're big or small. And so again, I think, as far as, given that back to the 85% that doesn't necessarily have a problem with rules, it has a problem with who decides those rules. As the old rules are being eroded, there is, in a sense, an opportunity to go back to those rules if it is important that some rules exist, right? So I think there's an element of agency that we could end up seeing as a result of, as I said, the US checking out of the system that it built.
And on that optimistic note, Natalie, Kishore, Ed, thank you so much for really a mind-nourishing conversation. This was 3D chess as well as group therapy. Thanks for joining us. And that was Natalie Tocci, Ed Luce, and Kishore Mahbubani. Next week, we will have the Indian public intellectual Pankaj Mishra on to talk about his new book, The World After Gaza. You will not want to miss it. Sign up below. I'm Ravi Agrawal. Thanks for watching.